Borislava just introduced us to a very interesting case study looking at post-conflict or post-violence education in Croatia. So I completed my master's thesis research on a similar topic looking in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And so I'm not going to present on the entire findings of my thesis. I am going to take a couple of interesting tracks and walk you through them to give you an idea of some of the complexities and interesting issues that I found most interesting to grapple with, and hopefully we can have a discussion about them. So Borislava gave you a little bit of history, so I'll go fast, but essentially the conflict in Bosnia lasted between 1992 and 1995, generally seen as three main conflicting parties: Bosniaks or Bosnian Muslims, and then Croats, Bosnian Croats supported by Croatia, and Bosnian Serbs supported by Serbia, which was then, as Borislava noted, still a part of former Yugoslavia, and so potentially Yugoslavs, depending on how you look at it. Was ended in 1995 by the Dayton Agreement, which was negotiated in Dayton, Ohio, which is why it's called the Dayton Agreement, and did three fundamentally important things. One of them is that, or two that I'll touch on. One of them is that it split the country of Bosnia into two entities, one of them called Republika Srpska, or the Serb Republic, and the other Federacija Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The federation is composed ethnically of Bosniaks and Croats, and the Republika Srpska is mostly composed of ethnic Serbs. And there's further differentiation below the federation into 10 cantons, which are also essentially ethnically divided. And so to give you an idea of what this looks like, there hasn't been a census officially in Bosnia since 1991, before the war. These are the 1991 numbers. And so what you can see is the green is Muslims or Bosniaks, the blue is Serbs, and the red is Croats. It's an interesting coloration because normally red is Serb and blue is Croat, so don't be confused when the next map comes up. I don't know who colored this map. So this gives you a little bit more nuanced look of what was ethnically going on. The map that I'm going to show you quickly this is from the Office of the High Representative, which was an overarching body that was set up to monitor the Dayton Agreement. They've provided a map of assumed numbers in 1998. These are not as official as the 1991 numbers because it was not an official census, but it gives us an idea. And part of what you can see, this white line here that you see in both maps, it didn't exist in 91, it did in 98. This is the entity border line. So all of this area here that you see that's red, that's the Republika Srpska. The area in here that's green and blue and a little bit yellow, that's the Federation. So one of the easiest ways to look at where you're going to find tensions is where the colors change. So very briefly, if you look at this region here, you can see largely ethnically Serb, the red, don't be confused, it's not Croats. And then here it becomes largely ethnically blue, so mostly Serb. A couple of the regions that I'm going to touch on quickly, this area in here, you can see it's primarily green for Bosniaks, becomes primarily blue for Croats. You also see a lot of that happening on this side of the country. A lot of green and red mixed, becomes almost exclusively red, with the exception of this little tiny area here. So this gives you a little bit of an idea of what was happening ethnically before and after the war, and where you're going to see some kind of tensions popping up.
I guess it's important to mention, Jackie, that those differences between 91 and 98 occurred because of ferocious ethnic cleansing-based fighting.
Let's just call it ferocious. Yeah. A lot of people don't like the term ethnic cleansing, but if you look at what happened, that's really what it is. And so the second thing that the Dayton Agreement did that I see as important is it said absolutely nothing about education. And so the word education is mentioned once in the Dayton Agreement. It grants the right to education as one of the fundamental rights and freedoms, but that's it. So you have a post-conflict country coming out of, Bosnia declared its independence officially about a month before the violence broke out. So you literally had this country that was a part of the former Yugoslavia, becomes its own nation, is thrown into violence, comes back out, is trying to create its own education system, and there was no really official guideline about how to do this. So In 2002, around between 2002 and 2003, the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, took up education reform as part of its mission. And that's when you really see the international community gets massively involved in education reform in Bosnia. Morislava and I realized the other day that we're going to completely confuse you because we classify the types of schools differently. But the classification that I used, and this is mine, this isn't what's used necessarily all the time, is 3 different types. Primarily mono-ethnic schools, which is generally a majority of one ethnicity. Occasionally you will see schools that have like 99% of one ethnicity and 1 or 2 students that are another ethnicity. Sometimes it's a little more even, but when I'm saying mono-ethnic, I'm talking 90% and above one particular ethnicity. Primarily multi-ethnic schools. For the most part, you rarely see schools, with the exception potentially of the Brčko district, that are actually almost evenly mixed. Normally you're going to get one majority no matter what, but there are schools that have closer percentages, and then divided schools, which are normally called 2 schools under one roof. And this is what Borislava was talking about, where you have members of 2 ethnicities using one school building, but being taught in different classrooms by different teachers, and normally in Bosnia by different textbooks, by different curriculum, different schools directors, different everything within the same building. So enough about that. So I started my thesis with some key understandings and then some key questions. Some of my understandings were that some international education reform has been successful. A lot of it has not been successful since 2002 when it started according to the initial goals, and that generally what we see right now is fairly stagnated reform efforts, but many programs, projects, and efforts currently active working in this environment. So Dr. Valerie Perry, she's one of our PhD alums, was the head of the OSCE's education reform mission for over 10 years. And I spoke to her last summer. Right? And her comment to me before I began my interview was, "Do you know that everyone is researching on Bosnian education now?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And so what questions did I have out of those understandings were, okay, so what are the problems in the education system that this international community effort is attempting to address? And what are the problems within the system that are seen by those directly involved in the system on the ground? What's the local community seeing? And are there any possible miscommunications? And what possible suggestions can be made for moving forward? So, my methods. Very briefly, what I did was in June and July of 2011, I traveled all over Bosnia. I did, what you can see on this side are areas where I conducted official interviews. What you can see on this side is most of the areas that I visited. So there were plenty of areas that I went to clarify things that I'd heard in interviews, to go and see, to document without actually conducting official interviews there. This is my interview team. Those are my local coordinators. All of my interviews were coordinated by this wonderful couple. And so they are the reason that I was able to talk to most of the people that I was. Methodologically,
were they Muslim,
so
Orthodox, or mixed?
Unfortunately, I couldn't get a third to be completely mixed, but Azra, who's the woman here, is Bosniak, Vjeko is a Croat. I didn't have a Serb on the team, but it was close.
How did you figure out the language when you speak this? How did they understand the language?
How did they were no understanding whatsoever. So as Borislava was hinting at, the languages really are almost exactly the same. Pre-war statistics show that there was a 3% difference between the languages. They all understand each other. It's kind of like me talking to Tom. We understand each other even though he's British and I'm American. But so we didn't have too many issues with comprehension. Methodologically, I'm personally and subjectively against recording interviews, because my experience has been as soon as you put a tape recorder in front of someone, they censor about 50% of what they were going to say. And so I did not record anything, but in order to keep making sure that I was not biasing myself in the notes that I was taking, I brought a secondary researcher, Toby, who's sitting right here, and he's in this picture, we conducted every interview together. We both took notes on all the questions and responses, and we had those available for comparison later to have some sense of balancing things out. All totaled, I did 26 interviews, 18 in the Federation, 6 in Republika Srpska, 1 in the Brčko district, and 1 in a school that sat directly on the entity line that was actually half in one entity and half in the other. And there's an overwhelming number of interviews in the Federation, mostly because a lot of the NGOs and government ministries and international organizations that I was talking to are based in Sarajevo, which is the capital city and is in the Federation. So that sort of put that number higher.
Jacquie, what's the significance of including Brčko?
The significance of including Brčko is it's up here. And it was one of the incredibly contentious points during the Dayton negotiations, almost derailed the negotiations because no one could decide whether it should be part of the Federation or the Republika Srpska. And actually the decision was to not give it to either one and to keep it under UN control. And so it was this very interesting district that during the peace negotiations was given to the UN essentially, and it's become a very interesting case because it's now used as the example and the model in a lot of ways for integration and education reform. Some of the most integrated schools you see in the country are in the Brčko district. So it was an interesting place to visit for that reason. So I'm going to take you very quickly through a couple of the places, through a couple of the places that I visited and some of the things that I found. And again, this is not everything, this is 1 or 2 select narratives. So starting in Sarajevo, capital city, this is, no, come back. There we go. This is the city of Sarajevo, set into the mountains. Absolutely beautiful place to be. I talked to several schools situated here, a couple of government ministries, and several of the international organizations that are working for reform. As I mentioned, the biggest one is the OSCE. The OSCE's initial education reform mission stated, "We will ensure that all children have access to quality education in integrated, multicultural schools that are free from political, religious, cultural, and other bias and discrimination, and which respect the rights of all children." So very easy to achieve. And so I did 2 separate interviews with members of the OSCE mission, one who is currently working there, and the other I mentioned, Dr. Valerie Perry, who was the head for 10 years, though she's working elsewhere now. And there is still this huge stress on this idea of integration versus segregation is really what you see in talking to members of this organization. And the main examples that they give that came up in both interviews were the idea of 2 schools under 1 roof, which, as I mentioned, is two ethnicities using the same school building. Mostar is the most famous example of this, and it's the one that's brought up really often. As I mentioned, the example of the Brčko district as a positive example. And then an interesting example that came up in my interviews this year was talking about monoethnic schools and the issue of parents in the example that was given in Foča, which is a city in the Republika Srpska. Muslim parents, so Bosniak parents, driving their children over the entity border to Gorazde, which is in the Federation, in order to send their kids to a majority Bosniak school. Even though the school in Foča would have accepted Bosniak children, driving them over the border and sending them to a school where their ethnicity is the majority. So I decided to go and check all these places out and see what was going on there. So beginning in Mostar, this is Mostar. It's probably the most famous city in all of Bosnia. This picture or close to it, and these are all our pictures, either Toby or I took everything that's on here. But very close to this picture is the cover. It's the cover of our contemporary conflict resolution textbook. It's a really famous
Ram's Bottom.
Yes.
Woodhouse, Meow.
So this city is very famous for this bridge and this cross. And I'm not going to go into either one of them right now because we don't have too much time, but I'd love to talk at length about both at any time. Mostar is also probably one of the most destroyed cities in all of Bosnia. It was a massive key point for the fighting between Bosniaks and Croats. A lot of the front lines were in Mostar, and so there is a lot of tension around this idea. So Mostar is famous for its Stara Gimnazia, its old gymnasium, which is probably the most famous example of two schools under one roof in Bosnia. I did not actually conduct official interviews there, partially because Azura Tormajic, who's noted up here, had just completed 22 months of ethnographic fieldwork in this gymnasium just before this project and had a wealth of information to draw from. And so I actually went consciously to two schools under one roof in other areas of the country to try to, in some ways, triangulate some of that data that she had already gathered. But to tell you a tiny bit about this school, after the Dayton Agreement, the Mostar Gymnasium was located on what was the Croat side of the city. And so all of the Croats sent their kids to the gymnasium. All of the Bosniaks sent their kids to gymnasium in an old primary school building on the other side of the city. Seeing that this was happening, the US government offered to donate $1 million if both sides agreed to move the Bosniaks back into the old gymnasium building. There was a lot of negotiation around this, including, this is a quote from one of the Bosniak teachers at the time who said, "We don't want to make peace, we just want our building back." And this seems to in some way be a general narrative around this move. The Bosniaks were moved back into the building, they were given the $1 million, and it became a two-school under one roof. In that, yes, they entered the building, but integration stopped there. All classrooms were completely separated, all teachers were separated. They were conducting education in two separate languages, two separate texts. At that time, the Croat side was using textbooks imported from Croatia, and so learning that their country looked like Croatia and their capital was in another country. And so, interesting narratives going on. The OSCE was also heavily involved here. What's interesting about it is that there was an initial push for integration, and there was a huge amount of pushback from the ground against this idea of integration. And so instead of using the term integration, the international community started using the term unification, saying all we want to do is just unify you. You don't have to integrate, you don't have to be the same. And there was pushback against that term. And so then they started to say, okay, administrative unification. The classes don't have to be the same, but let's at least unify the administration. And the administrative unification was successful. So the Mostar Gymnasium is touted as a success story because the administration at the very highest level is the same. Below that, there's still no shared classrooms. There's still no shared curriculum. And what's interesting is that most of the fundraising done for these efforts was done by using the word integration when talking to the international community and the word administrative unification when talking to the local community.
And to avoid further cognitive dissonance for Americans, gymnasium in this context is gymnasium,
high school.
Back to the ancient Greek term for a pre-university educational institution, which is how the Germans use it.
Not the athletic field.
Right. Not a gym. It's basically a high school. So what's interesting about this, and these are some of the quotes that we do not have to read all of, but this is part of Azra's research, and a lot of the things that she found. So this deals with a little bit more why the term integration was so contentious. And so what she finds is that for the majority of people, especially the Croats and Serbs in Bosnia, integration is understood as either the return to pre-war Yugoslav ethnic relations or an assimilation into a larger dominant group and a related loss of ethnocultural identity. Both are seen as dangerous to the survival of the ethnically defined communities. So in some ways what you're seeing is people saying, we fought a war not to have this, and we are not going to do it. And so this also talks more specifically about language. For purposes of time, I'm going to skip past it. One of the other things that I noticed that is interesting to me to bring up is this idea of international rewards systems. This is the Mostar Gymnasium. It is, as I mentioned, one of the most contentious schools in the country, probably, and has probably gotten more international aid than any other location, and yet still has students in completely separate classrooms, despite the international push for integration. This is the first primary school in Sarajevo. This school has integrated every single OSCE reform, including the contentious ones, and continues to do so today, has the largest population of Roma in attendance almost anywhere in the country, has a completely integrated school population, which does not just include Bosniak Serbs and Croats, but also includes many of the other peoples that are in Bosnia that are actually even smaller percentages.
Including Jews.
Including Jews.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting statement just to look at where the money is clearly going from the international community. And in some ways there are narratives that I was hearing around this in some of my interviews of what's rewarded. You're rewarded if you're ethnically divisive and tense, not if you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. And this is very difficult to read, but I absolutely love this. Quote, in the words of a professor of philosophy at the Mostar Gymnasium and leader of the Union of Croat Secondary School Teachers, in the year 2000, I got a hold of the International Crisis Group report that said, the key to the Bosnia and Herzegovina state's survival is Mostar. And the key to the survival of Mostar is the Mostar Gymnasium. This means that everything revolves around us, the country's future depends on our success. In other words, we are the center of the world. So that gives you a little bit about that.
ICG said that, so.
Yeah. So Mostar is a very interesting case of two schools under one roof. I also decided to travel to Jacquie, which it's going to zoom in on it, but is up here. This is the area that I showed you on the map earlier that was formerly majority Bosniak and shows up on the OSCE map later as majority Croat. Just to briefly let you know, two schools under one roof only exist in the Federation. They only exist in 3 cantons of the Federation. One of them is Mostar, the other one is Jacquie, the last one is Zenica Travnik. And they account for about 1% of all schools in the country. So I went to Jacquie to check out the schools there. This is the city of Jacquie. It's incredibly famous for being the seat of the old Bosnian kings. You can see the fortress at the top here. It's also more recently famous for being the area where this Congress, this yeah. Avnoy, thank you, took place. We'll just use the local terms. This was essentially the meeting that, after the Second World War, formed the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. And this took place in the city of Jacquie. That's me imitating them.
I think Tito is not voting.
He is. I chose not to sit in Tito's chair, but he's right here. I took the chair next to him. It's the same room, it's the same chairs. They still have it set up. I do have a picture of Toby sitting in Tito's chair. He decided to. And so I visited another two school under one roof in Jacquie. The interesting thing about this one in comparison to Mostar is that where the Mostar Gymnasium is still called Stara Gimnazija, or Old Gymnasium for both sides, this school is actually has 2 completely separate schools that use 2 different names, depending on what side of the school building you're on. And so the first side of the school here, the Bosniak side, which they would just call their own school, I spoke to the pedagogue of this institution, and one of the things that I did when I was conducting these interviews was, rather than walking in and asking people, what are the problems with your school, what's going on, what are the issues, I asked everyone, if you could have anything you wanted, what are your dreams for this school? And then what's preventing you from achieving those dreams right now? And it was a different way of getting at what the problems were. And so part of what I learned about this side of the school was a lot of complaints about there not being enough classrooms, that they had to hold lectures in the library, that the pedagogues of both sides were working together, the directors of both sides of the school were working together, the students were not. Although they did do some joint workshops, they were actually doing one while we were there with all of the kids from both sides. But she made the interesting note that kids in this school are driven by aggression and violence, which I'm pulling out because I think it's an interesting thing to say when you have 2 contentious groups in one building and the international push is move them closer together, put them in classes together. And the other thing that she noted is that this school is part of a larger school body. It's one of 13 schools under this one heading all throughout the country. So they don't actually see themselves as part of this school building at all. They see themselves as part of this group of schools that's all around. They happen to be in this building. Some of the dreams that she mentioned were to have 2 separate schools, not both in one building. And when asked why, she said, because then we would have 30 teachers in this building instead of 60 or 70, and we would have our own space. And then returning to this idea of aggressive or violent kids, to have better help for children with behavioral problems. I walked across the lobby and went to the other side of the school and talked to the pedagogue and the director over there, which is now the Croat side of the school. They had a slightly more positive view of things. They said, yes, the conditions are bad, but the people are so creative. And also mentioned that this school is also part of a larger school body. It's one of 2. The other school was actually visible up on the hill. And their dreams, the interesting thing when asked about their dreams was the response was, everything is a dream for us. And then responded that what they'd like to have is windows, new equipment, new toilets, and computers that work.
And in the Bosniak framing, the Berta Kuchera School of the building, were the aggression and violence expressed on an ethnic basis? Like Bosniaks against Croats and Croats against Bosniaks?
No, what they mentioned was an economic basis, actually. This kid has an iPhone and this kid can't afford his lunch. And that it was actually a different framing.
So it's not a continuation of the war?
No, and so what was interesting about this school, and also in contrast to the Mostar Gymnasium, is that the framings that were used here were very much of 2 completely separate schools. There was no sense of we're one school building and we happen to be in separate classrooms. It was, we're a completely separate school, we have partner schools in this other area, we have partner schools in this other area, and we happen to be together in one school building, but we'd rather just be in separate buildings because we're separate schools anyway. This was just another interesting note. I ended up having lunch with a family and some of the kids who attended the school afterwards. So these 2 little kids who you see on the side here are actually attendants of the Bosniak side of the school. And although there were no official interviews here that are in my thesis, they in many ways corroborated this narrative of, they were very confused when I was trying to explain that I was talking to both sides of the school and kept saying, oh, you're talking to 2 different schools. You're talking to another school. Rather than, no, I'm just walking across the hall and talking to someone on the other side of the hall. So what are some of the takeaways from this idea of 2 schools under one roof? One of them is question of language and terminology. Is the international community, and particularly the OSCE, pushing for integration, pushing for unification, pushing for administrative unification? What do those things mean and what do we get from them? The other interesting thing, and the narrative that I heard very often, is the idea that 2 schools under one roof were created by the international community. And you see that very strongly in the Mostar Gymnasium, where the US government literally gave this massive amount of money to move the 2 sides into one school. And so there's a pushback on the idea of, why are you trying to kill this thing? You created it, decide what you want, and stop bothering us, essentially. And then part of what you see in Vytautas is that there were stronger desires for more separation into individual buildings rather than further unification into one building. And then, as I noted, 2 schools under one roof account for roughly 1% of all schools in the country, but are gaining probably more than half of the international attention and funds, as you can see from everything that's poured into the Mostar Gymnasium. And an OSCE report in 2007 called 2 schools under one roof the most discussed issue in education in Bosnia and Herzegovina today. Does that proportionally make sense? So, to finish, I'm going to touch on this narrative that was also brought up of the monoethnic schools in Foča and Gorazde. So, just to reiterate, what was happening was Bosniak parents in Foča, this is all part of the Republika Srpska, were driving their children over this entity line to take them to school in Gorazde because it was a majority Bosniak school. And this was pointed out by both members of the OSCE who I spoke to as highly problematic, a huge issue we need to deal with. Parents are perpetuating this idea. So I went to both schools to check it out. This is the one picture that we didn't take, so it's not my fault that it's bad. But this is Foča, and this is the school team that we spoke to there. This is the school director, the pedagogue, and one of the assistant teachers. All came out to speak with us about the school. And no. No, Right, so ethnically Serb, which means Orthodox for the most part. Yeah. Oh yeah, no, absolutely. That's St. Sava, and this is actually called the St. Sava School.
Oh.
So this is, as you can see, yes. So yes, this is actually called the St. Sava School. Clearly a mono-ethnic school, as you can see from the images on the wall and the name of the school. So what were some of the dreams from this school? They wanted equipment for the school to be better. They said their biggest dream was to fix the leaking hole in the roof of the gym because students keep falling.
Not to be confused with gymnasium.
Not to be confused with gymnasium, this is actually the athletic facility. There was a big hole in the roof and students kept falling during athletic classes, and so their largest dream was to fix that hole. After that was the idea of better motivation for everyone. They noted that there had been no trainings or school inspections from the ministry since 2003. No one had come to this school. And just to show a couple of quotes from this interview, generally the idea was that education is on a very low level, and they said this of students and teachers together. And speaking about teachers, new teachers who were brought in, the comment they made was the older they are, the longer they stay, the less interested they are, and it's the same with the parents. And so this was an interesting narrative to hear, especially when we compare it with Gorazde. So Gorazde was famous because it was one of the cities in the country that was a former UN safe area. There were several safe areas during the violence that were created by the UN. They sent soldiers in, they promised to keep these areas safe. Every single one of them fell.
Like Srebrenica.
Like Srebrenica, that's the most famous one. Gorazde is famous for being a safe area and also for this bridge right here across the city, which you can see is clearly a central point, because what they did to keep themselves safe is they built a second bridge underneath it, which you can see here, and this is a better view. This was the only area where you could cross this river without being shot, because it was, yeah, because it was built, and it still exists. We crossed it. It's still perfectly structural. So they kept the city safe in many ways because of this. But as you can see, this is what anyone will immediately show you when you go to Gorazde. And so it's this memory of we kept ourselves safe throughout this. This is the Bosniak school in Gorazde, and this is the school where theoretically Bosniak parents who didn't want to send their kids to the St. Sava school were sending them instead. On the day that we were there was another Dutch organization visiting, which was in the process of creating a 4-year school of pedagogy with internships and exchanges for the students. The director spoke of already an existing partnership with the University of Zurich, which included 6 to 7 day exchange programs, including homestays for all of the students of the school. The director's office was absolutely full of international donations. He had a huge large screen TV on his wall. He had brand new backpacks lined up. And when asked about his dreams, he spoke of a community space for children, a playground, the size of the school building to be expanded, the school to be off the main road so it was a little more secluded and children could play, and the idea of, he actually said one of his dreams is to have more Serb children come and attend this school. And he noted that although it is a mono-ethnic school and majority Muslim, we take care of those kids, believe me, much more. Not everyone is guilty for this war. So
that is an amazing revelation. It'll be interesting to see what extent that is a dominant narrative.
Yeah. So why are Bosniak families from Foča sending their children to the school in Gorazde? And is this entirely a question of ethnicity, or is there more going on?
The gene being used.
Right. So if your choice is to send your kids to a school where by their own definition, the educational standards are very low, the teachers are lazy, there's a hole in the gym, and the ministry hasn't been around since 2003, or the school where they get exchange programs to other places in Europe and they get to travel and they have all these other partnerships. And so is there more going on? And will demanding integration solve this issue? Is that goal really going to have an effect there? So some conclusions and suggestions. So those are two of the narratives. There's a whole lot more. I can send you my thesis if you're interested in it. But based on those two, some of the biggest takeaways were the idea of integration as actually forced or threatening. And I have remember Allport's contact hypothesis, which often is stated as if you bring groups together really often, they're going to learn to like each other more. And actually what his hypothesis says much more is that it's fairly dangerous to bring groups together. The only reason they're ever going to increase positive interaction is if they're of relatively equal status, and most importantly, they have common goals. So if you don't bring groups together that have common goals, and you in fact bring groups together that have competing goals, Allport says you're actually going to increase negative tensions between the groups. And so what are the alternatives? And can we use a broader definition of integration? And actually, Dr. Valerie Perry offered one during my interview with her when I asked, how could you see this idea of integration differently? Is there a broader definition? She said, sure. You could define integration as an environment in which any child can go to study in any school in the country without feeling like an outsider. And that's a very different definition than we need 30% Muslim, 30% Croat, 30% Bosniak in every, sorry, 30% Serb in every school.
It's back to the issue of the overarching identity.
Exactly. And so the final recommendation from the Foča and Goražde case is maybe we should be focusing more on quality than on whether or not and how many percentages of each ethnicity are together in the school. So that's a section of my research.